Well, it's 6:30. So good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are in the world. I just wanted to introduce myself before we started our discussion today. I am Dr. Brian Culp, Kennesaw State University. Kennesaw State is about 30 minutes north of Atlanta, Georgia. Um, I have been a professor here at this particular university for 7 years. I've had some previous experience at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. I've spent some time in Montreal, Canada on a Fulbright. And I think more importantly, I think for our purposes here, I did spend some time as a classroom teacher before someone told me that you could actually get a doctorate in health and physical education. I do a lot of work related to anti-racism and pedagogy. I do a lot of work related to public health. I do a lot of work related to sport. And I have found that all of those different things sort of interconnect. So today, we're going to be talking about and discussing eliminating dehumanizing practices with indigenous populations. And the first part of the presentation is we're going to talk about positionality. And the reason why I'm going to do that is because I don't necessarily assume that an audience knows about positionality in terms of how we have structured or how we have tried to fit indigenous groups into different definitions. And I think it's going to be important for us today to recognize that, as so much of what we'll be talking about the second half of this presentation has to do with movement, has to do with space, and has to do with how can we construct situations to where youth are humanized, but also youth are humanized in conjunction with thinking about the land. So 1 second, I'll get our presentation up and rolling, share my screen. Okay. So I believe at this point, everyone should see my screen. Please let me know in chat if for some reason you do not. Stop share for a second. So you have, okay. All right. Everybody at this point, I believe, should be seeing my first slide. Again, if you do not, let me know, because sometimes it's a little bit wonky here in terms of internet pieces. So again, eliminating dehumanizing practices with indigenous populations. Perfect. Okay. Thank you, Naomi. I think the first thing to kind of keep in mind, and I was asked to do this by Dan and Susan, and one of the things that we wanted to talk about here was obviously physical education. And today we're going to do a discussion of current trends and perspectives, how to understand dehumanization in the context of where we are right now in 2023, how to humanize youth, thinking about a concept that I don't think we talk about enough, which is spatial justice, and then talk about some research and programming. And then we're going to leave some time for your questions and answers as well. I'll try to leave up about 15 minutes or so. If we're getting a little bit closer to that, somebody again in chat, just let me know where we're at. I would say as well, this particular topic of dehumanization, I wrote a pretty lengthy article about it in issue of Jopert about 1.5 years ago, and I can send you some links to that if you'd like to see it. So the first thing is positionality. And one thing I remind people all the time is that I am here, but I'm also realistic. I think representation matters. I am very understanding of the fact that when we think about people who could do this work probably a lot better than I am in terms of talking about this topic, we have to recognize the fact that they are, quite frankly, not a whole lot of people who can talk about this topic because of historical things that have happened in terms of structure, in terms of who we have access in terms of education, and then even into another extent, who do we have access to in terms of higher education. So recognizing that, I think, is a big part of this whole piece. For the purposes of this presentation, Native Americans, American Indians, First Americans, and Indigenous Americans are going to be exchangeable pieces. We're going to talk a little bit first about Indigenous just as a whole, and then what we're going to talk about is how these issues are specific to what is going on in the United States. So positionality and land justice is an important piece of this. I think as we have so many different youth who use recreation as a part of understanding space, and we recognize the fact that there are ecological different pieces, social pieces, and racial justice pieces when we talk about land, it's important to understand this positionality of land justice. And we recognize three different things here that Nuns and Jones kind of reward us here with. We talk about protecting land from extraction. We talk about regenerating the health of the land and ecosystems. And one of the pieces is expanding land equity back to Black, Indigenous, and other dispossessed communities. So as I mentioned earlier, movement and the idea of dehumanization can all be tied to this. In fact, I don't think you can really understand dehumanization in terms of this particular topic if you don't talk about land. When we think about things such as reservations, when we think about things, as we'll talk about later, broken treaties, and how bodies are perceived among certain societies. So when we look at a couple interesting perspectives, as we sort of go into this discussion, we recognize in terms of looking at the world and Indigenous peoples, here are some themes that kind of have come about over the past 100 years or so. The first one is rights to land, territories, and resources. The second is one that I touched on a minute ago, was land as a source of Indigenous people's cultural, spiritual, social, and political identity. The third is, unfortunately, violent conflicts that come directly related to those land issues. We think about a significant number of health-related issues, which I'm going to go into in a minute. We think about lack of political representation, which is obviously still an issue that we see in many parts of the world. And we recognize because of that lack of political representation and because of structural inequalities and essentially racism, that there are economic and educational disadvantages that go along with that. Which brings us to our next point, that are issues when we think about things that are very specific to North America, or as some people would consider called Turtle Island. So one foundational discussion is to understand that racism against Native Americans began from the first moments that Europeans set foot on the land that they would later call the United States of America. Europeans also believed that the original inhabitants were lesser and savages. We'll talk about framing in a second. And so they felt justified in stealing land and committing genocide against these Indigenous groups. And as we recognize myths about Native Americans, myths about Indigenous groups, depending on what part of the world you're from, and this labeling of Indians were frequently portrayed as bloodthirsty bad guys in films with white American men as the heroes. Many of us also know, if we look at movies from the 1930s through the 1970s, you would see white men representing themselves as Indians. And it was an interesting juxtaposition of some of the things that would happen even in media and film. Another foundational point that we need to recognize specific to North America, but not only in North America, was thinking about this aspect of settler colonialism. And what it says here is the goal of settler colonization is the removal and erasure of Indigenous people in order to take the land for use by settlers and perpetuate. Now, a lot of people who are not hip to this, so to speak, don't recognize that this is still happening today. We still see historically settled colonial agendas have happened through the removal of neighborhoods. We see things that have happened through genocide, which I'm going to break down a little bit further. And really things that we see as terms of broken and ignored treaties. When we recognize different concepts as well, we have settler colonialism. I think another foundational concept to understand is the idea of manifest destiny. So this idea that the United States was destined by God or some type of spiritual religious figure as advocates of the time, believed that that spiritual figure, that God figure, was told to expand dominion and spread democracy and capitalism across North America. And when we say North America, we also have to recognize this fact that Canada is included in that. Many times when we talk about issues related to Indigenous people in North America, it's not necessarily posed as Canada is a part of that, and they actually are as well. Some other definitions here as we move on here is genocide and understanding what that actually means. Killing members of a group, causing some type of bodily or mental harm, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about some type of destruction, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, a little thing that people do not recognize with genocide, and then forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. We have seen a lot more discussions of this, I think, in the past few years, particularly when we think about schools and residential schools and some of the youth that have been moved. But also, sadly, we have seen that graves have been unearthed around these schools and in these schools in some cases when we talk about genocide, because the people who ran these schools wanted to essentially hide the fact that they were doing nefarious activity. One example of this, and again, we are not, time does not permit us to go through a lot of these things, but I think it's very important in understanding sort of where we're coming in with dehumanization. 19th century in the United States government would start relocating Native Americans into reservations. One of these things that would happen as a result of that, and we see Sitting Bull right here, is that anytime we have had marginalized or what people would consider minority groups that have decided to take it upon themselves to express themselves, express their heritage, it has created media sensationalism. We have often talked about this the past few years in result of thinking about things from the Black perspective. I would also tell people, and I have to remind many of my colleagues and friends as well, that there are Indigenous groups that have lived here in some spaces longer than Black groups. And we have to recognize that anytime a group is marginalized, is trying to gain some sort of power, that media sensationalism usually comes as a form of that. We recognize that with Wounded Knee, about 300 Lakota people who were mostly unarmed, and many of them were women and children, were killed by the United States Army. And I think one thing to sort of recognize as well, this was rewarded from the United States of America when we looked at 20 soldiers who were awarded the Medal of Honor, which is a pretty significant piece of honor. And they were awarded to essentially increase racist domination here. So as we're moving on here, and we're getting to how to talk about the dehumanization process, we have to recognize that the definition of indigeneity is based on a few different pieces here that we've kind of discussed. So again, self-identification and acceptance by a community. Historical continuity with pre-colonial, pre-settler societies. What would be considered strong links to territories and surrounding national resources. Very distinct social and political systems. Interestingly enough, part of what we talked about with treaties historically, they were broken in order to undermine these social, economic, and political systems. And the next piece, which we talk about, language. And then one of the pieces when we talk about colonization is also the ability of people to want to reproduce their ancestral environments and distinctive people, and not necessarily get paid to leave their land. We recognize colonization as well was invasion as a structure. We recognize that people who were involved with colonization wanted to frame realities, and through the framing of that realities, these things have been replicated over time. You replace Native history, you replace Native knowledge, and when you replace these types of things, you typically have the following when you think about invasion as a structure. And getting to some of the things we see in our society right now, poverty and unemployment. So in the United States, 1 out of 3 Native Americans are living in poverty, with the average individual earning a median income of just under $23,000 per year. Living conditions, another public health piece and societal piece, overcrowded communities or higher instances of homelessness. We see lower graduation rates. I spoke at that at the outset when we talk about representation. Educational systems do not accommodate Indigenous students' perspectives. In fact, when you look at history books, they don't talk about anything at all related to that. They don't talk about treaties. They don't talk about land. We see that these things are from a very strict European Western world perspective that basically favors, again, one side of education. Another piece here, 70% of Native American students continue their information after high school, while we look at 60% of the United States population, irrespective of race, class, and culture, they do. When we think about Indigenous women, girls, and gender nonconforming people, we look at Native women and girls, for instance, are murdered at a rate of 10 times higher than other ethnicities. Voting rights are violated. We find that when we have people who, when we think about voting and we think about the restriction of voting, historically and now, polling sites are few and far between, which is not just a distraction, but a deterrent from people to vote. We have known about the exploitation of natural resources on native land. Well, from a health equity perspective, Indigenous adolescents globally are 30% more likely to be obese. And when we think about mental illness, higher rates of suicide and trauma. And when you think about erasure, genocide, and cultural exploitation, these are treated as if they're no longer relevant. We don't cover it like we should. And generally, when we do cover it, it is through the guise of something talking about, for instance, some holiday, the United States holidays such as Thanksgiving, which we know was not accurate. We also see things such as costumes and mascots. I mentioned to people before, I am 30 minutes away from Atlanta, Georgia. As some of you can probably appreciate here, the discussion about our mascot in the Atlanta Braves has been a very ferocious one, but we still see that. People who would rather take the capitalism aspect of it instead of thinking about how these things misappropriate culture and other people. Now, this is moving on to our last slide before we talk about some movement related things. I mean, again, this is some historical pictures that, and I will leave these slides for obviously Dan and Susan as requested, but you could see some of the things and when we talk about representation. I mean, we've had the grievance, the 27 Declaration of Independence. You would be surprised, or maybe you wouldn't be, because this may be probably a pretty savvy group. At Declaration of Independence had other articles related to it as well, that had things that specifically talked about Native American Indigenous populations in terms of what type of representation that they wouldn't have, which would lead to things we see such as the Dawes Act of 1887, which were people basically parceling and selling land away from these particular groups. And as I mentioned before, you look at the representation in about 1800 up here at the top right corner of the screen, when we talk about land versus what that looks like now in terms of reservations and what were historically forced encampments. Now, that is a lot to unpack, and I think we did a pretty good job of doing that within probably 10 to 15 minutes. So now the aspect here is to talk about how dehumanization fits into all of this particular structure, as we see a couple different representations here that many of us are probably familiar with. I think the first thing to understand when we think about looking at dehumanization and the process of what happens there, Herbert Kleiman in 1973 talked about these two different pieces of dehumanization, one of which is identity. And if we've been paying attention the past few minutes, recognize that identity is a very important thing in terms of who controls the narrative. You have Native identity, Indigenous identity versus colonization identity. and people who've not been here on land before, previously. We also talk about community. These are two different things. When we give a person identity, or they have identity and they have the age to have community, those are two different pieces. When they're out of structure, when they're violated, we're dehumanizing the person. We recognize with dehumanization something as well that I've talked about before. You have an in group versus the out group. When you're a dehumanized individual, you're not part of the in group. And what you are considered then is a person outside of moral kinship, or a person that cannot be redeemed, or a person who needs to be civilized. And if you are turned into a person who needs to be civilized, you are more of a legitimate target for active oppressions and exclusions. And this gets normalized. And then we have a set of other issues, such as the doctrine of discovery. Again, some people may not necessarily recognize kind of what this went down to, but the doctrine of discovery was essentially a 15th century discussion with papal bulls that basically justified the conquering the land of who they considered non-Christian or non-God affiliated. It justified warfare, it justified land theft, it outlawed language, and it created boarding schools, as I mentioned before, destruction of religious sites, private wealth, those different types of things. Now, we ask ourselves here, when we're thinking about a dehumanized person, we have to recognize that a dehumanized person is typically told that they are lesser than by an outside entity. In this case, this is an example of something that happened that gave justification to manifest destiny, justification for broken treaties, justification for the invalidation of Native people's lands, and normalization. That normalization in 1823 in the United States happened through the Supreme Court. When we talk about how it's not supposed to be political, it most definitely was. John Marshall, who was the lead justice on there, you had legal people who began to cite this doctrine of discovery to invalidate Native people's claims to their land. So these types of things would lead to forcible movement. And in addition to religion, or the perception of religion, it was part of the narrative that Earth's domain is for the profit of the chosen people. And chosen people were not indigenous folks. We recognize as well in 2023, just earlier in this year in January, it was repudiated by the Vatican. But as I've mentioned, and will all of you can probably appreciate, well, what does that do currently for people? Because you're not much as I'm a little bit cynical when people do land acknowledgements. And while I recognize that, for instance, some people think that that is appropriate, typically what happens is there's no discussion of land justice in terms of how we can try to get things to somewhat level. It'll never be equal, but just acknowledging some of the things and really providing for people some opportunities for some sort of reparations as a core of that. As we see here, some different examples of media and propaganda. The noble savage here is on our left side. We've seen this in music, Pharrell. This was on the cover of LA magazine a few years ago. Headdress is a really big thing that's appropriated by other groups when we dehumanize them. As I mentioned before, we had here baseball. This was the Cleveland Indians that for years, I mean, most people recognize if you follow sport, they changed 2 years ago to the Cleveland Guardians. We see things such as toys, army men, and how they have perpetuated themselves over years. And then obviously literature, as we see here with the book by Dennis Stovall, that unfortunately aided to a lot of different perceptions of what Native Americans and Indians were when we look at these propaganda related things. More propaganda. Okay, we see this in Word documents in terms of what people think about. Savages, alcoholics, casinos, drug addicts, uneducated poor. This idea of a noble savage, and as I mentioned before, Charleston Heston here playing the role of this Native American who is really trying to negotiate life. Honoring, think about people and how they look at different things related to sports. Even games when we grew up playing for some of us in different schools, like Cowboys versus Indians. And even in situations where we think they're positive about pollution, we're sitting there and recognizing the fact that this was the famous crying Indian from the 1970s, but we found out a few years before this particular gentleman passed that he was actually not Native American or indigenous at all. So red savage is a stereotype when we think about a dehumanizing type of concepts. That particular person is known to have no redeeming qualities whatsoever. They are bloodthirsty seekers of war and violence, hence the picture that we have here on the right. Because they can't be redeemed, they must be exterminated. We look at Native mascots and we see those different types of things with war cries. We see tomahawk chops. We see warrior imagery. We see, for those of you who obviously followed the Super Bowl this year, Kansas City Chiefs, these things have always been told that Native American groups are fine with it. But the answer to the question when you actually look in to do the research on it is that Native American groups actually report lower self-esteem and community worth. When that's research here a few years ago was on Native American students, and they asked them how they felt when they saw these different types of stereotypes and caricatures, and their self-esteem and community worth was actually fairly low, which speaks to some of the pieces we talked about earlier with mental health crisis, and it leads to things such as drug use and suicide and dropping out of school. The noble savage, just a brief description of that. It's a person who communicates with animals in spirit. It's an uncivilized person who's unbothered. We probably are thinking in terms of the most, one that is a character that's seen a lot is Pocahontas. And some of them who do a deep dive into history recognize that Pocahontas was actually taken advantage of. Some people think she was raped and she had a very short life, but the way it's depicted in cartoons and media is not necessarily the case. So we get to this question of the circle of inhumanity that always tends to find ourselves here. We're seeing here on the right an example of what was expressed before of 3 Lakota boys at Carlisle Indian and Industrial School. And we see on one end their representation of themselves versus the representation of what happens when Europeans, people who ran that particular school, wanted to basically shave their hair and put them in different clothing to try to make them more Eurocentric, ripping them of their culture. We have seen this happen a great deal of time. So when we think about circles of inhumanity, we start at the top here, and the first thing was positionality, talking about colonialism. The second part where we're at right now is talking about dehumanizing people. The third part of it we talked about was deculturalizing folks, so taking things away from them. The fourth piece was cultural appropriation and monetization. And then lastly, the piece of it, expected adherence to conform the standards of whiteness. And then it's a circle that pretty much goes on again, because again, colonialism has not stopped just because we have stopped talking about it in the history books. It's a circle of inhumanity that continues to be created over a period of time. When we think about from the health perspective, before we move on to our second part here, and maybe a few questions if anyone has them in the chat. This is from Canada. This came out most recently. It talks about the health framework for Indigenous people and how these different stressors create a ecosystem for Indigenous youth that is just deplorable, for lack of a better word. On the outside, the blue, you see the colonization, historic trauma, the Indian Acts, the treaties, the residual schools, okay? Then as you move a little bit closer to the middle, you see things such as how parents raise their children because they have been influenced by this outside circle, birthing rights, the built environment, which we talk about, what's actually involved with students involved in the work, climate change, language, land dispossession. And as you move a little bit further here, and you can look at this particular chart on your time, you start getting into some really significant things, such as what do students need to have? And the focus is obviously physical and mental health, cultural identity, and the idea and the practice of resilience to fight against all of these bigger things that are outside the circle, which undermine health outcomes for Indigenous people. So I'm going to stop right here. And if anyone has any questions, by my clock, we have about 7 o'clock, because the next part of this conversation is going to be talking about physical activity a bit. So if anyone has any questions in the chat, feel free to put them in so that therefore, when this part is over, we can just get right into the questions. And if you're still thinking about some things, there's nothing wrong with that as well. So now that we've talked about the process of dehumanizing youth, how do we humanize youth? And how do we humanize youth through a perspective that may be health and physical activity? Well, the first thing is to kind of recognize that we have, since the United States, in this context that we're talking about today, in most of the world, has viewed ethnics and racial groups as illegitimate, flawed, in need of acculturation. We have to have situations to point to where youth need approaches to teaching that are first intercultural, second holistic, and third pretty reflective. And another piece that I put down here is that culturally diverse youth, just as a general understanding, have to have a right to the city. And I've termed this not just right to the city, but right to the land, and thinking about how they actually belong to the land and can move in it and are encouraged to be healthy in helping to define what this means for them. Two of the things that I really like to have people look at are models. And these are two of the better ones that I've seen and ones that I've used before. And I've talked about how to humanize students, is that we first have to understand the different distractions that happen. So here's the Indigenous ecological systems model that we have on the left versus ecological systems theory. I think most of us are somewhat familiar with Bronfenbrenner's ecological system theories. We've probably seen it in some form or fashion. We're not as familiar with Indigenous ecological systems model. And I'm going to show another version of these two models so we can sort of break it down in terms of thinking about strategy here. So ecological systems theory from Bronfenbrenner, I think, as I mentioned here, is good to understand as a starting point. It essentially has a couple different pieces involved with it, and has the microsystem, which is the immediate environment. So that's the thing that we get up in the morning, and those are the people that we generally see on a pretty consistent basis, and the avenues that, or the places that we see on a pretty consistent basis, their routine. When we get to the second piece, we have a mesosystem, which explores those different connections around not just the people, but the home and school, the home and the workplace, if they are a youth that it gets older and is of working age, or even with their parents and how they work. The third piece you will see here is the ecosystem, which looks at the connections between the settings that surround the individual, but not just that, but how the youth, particular children, are influenced by their parents and also the neighborhood, and how their parents' work experience and lives may impact what goes on in terms of what that child sees. When we get to the macro system, we're thinking about things that get a little bit bigger at this point. When we think about outside of that circle, it's all the different pieces that we've talked about before But now what's added in is this idea of a national regime. What is a person's belief systems? What is a person's lifestyles? What are those hazards? And what are those things defined as? Finally, we look at the chronos system and we look at how these things have changed over a significant piece of time in terms of structural inequalities, laws, social and economic statuses, places of residence, because we recognize when people move that these different systems also change. In contrast, we have the Indigenous ecological systems model. And some of the foundational things that we talked about at the beginning of this particular presentation, it influences that settler colonialism makes a huge difference on how people see and have perceived the world. We think about as well the exclusion of Native histories, which equal adverse developmental outcomes. So the policies that have taken place that have influenced how youth are perceived in the world, Indigenous youth, excuse me, are perceived in the world. What I also liked about this model as well is that it helps with the construction of counter narratives. So if we think about narratives in terms of things that we've heard and we've always believed, the counter narrative is things that we look at the narratives about what we think about Native Americans, what we think about American Indians, indigenous populations around the world. The counter narrative is actually combating that overall narrative that has been created that is not ever acknowledged. And when we look at these different contexts and they go through the will, and I think it's very powerful to go back and just kind of review it and kind of look at some pieces. First of all, in the middle, obviously you see the history. As it moves out, you see culture, and you recognize that there is a specific focus on intergenerational learning and how values have been passed down. This is a very important thing because colonization wants to stop those first two. They are in opposition to history and they are in opposition to culture. When we get to Indigenous youth, we find that relationality and connectedness to ancestors is a very, very important piece. And you learn about that obviously through the information that has been passed down from the histories that we started with. When we think about other pieces in terms of immediate context, positive strength-based interactions with caregivers in schools. When we get a little bit further, we think about surrounding context, positive interactions between people. And then finally, thinking about policy changes and advocacy. So what are not necessarily the people who are in the situation who are marginalized, what are they doing? Not just what they're doing, but what are people who actually have some type of power? What are they doing in terms of assisting with youth? We recognize that, and we can't go through each one of these today, but this may be something that is valuable in reviewing, is we recognize that on the left of the chart here, we have what is considered in the United States context, traditional Native American values, and we recognize that contemporary mainstream values. So when we're thinking about youth and we're thinking about teaching youth and we're thinking about planning for youth, these are some things that we have to recognize. Again, as mentioned before, harmony with nature, and thinking about it in terms of the contrast, power over nature, cooperation. So what type of activities and games and things are we doing that don't stress competition? A lot of our activities and games in the United States, people just don't recognize that many of the team sports are a representation of military related types of engagements. When we talk about football, for instance, how many times do we hear things that are equated to what you would probably consider domination of land or war? We really have to think about those different types of pieces. A few other things here. Reliance on extended family in a traditional Native American context versus reliance on what people perceive as experts. And we also recognize the fact that statistically, we have a lot of Western world people from that particular mindset who consider themselves experts on everything, to the point that there's no other position that can be made. Other pieces, humility versus fame and recognition and winning, okay? A few other pieces: physical punishment versus physical punishment acceptable when we think about European values generally. We think about time being always with us when we look at Native American traditional values or Native American values, excuse me, versus watching the clock. We think about planning goals versus planning for the future and how to get ahead from a capitalistic mindset. We think about some of the other pieces, such as interjecting less versus European values of people who like to interject a lot. These are things we have to understand in terms of some values. And obviously you see here some other ones in terms of nonverbal communication versus people who talk a lot. Their skills are being highly prized. So some activities. One of the things I think we need to first understand is that activities need to be organic. Physical educators, and that's the world that I'm in, understand that students are physical beings. Therefore, we have to understand that when classes are not responsive to the physical need of youth, they're going to act out. So is the classroom a physically nurturing space, or is it a command style teaching where I make all of the rules and students follow? Second thing we need to recognize is the atmosphere for students psychodynamic. So how do they feel about themselves and their perception of learning? How does this impact skill attainment? How does it inspire lifelong participation? We think about pieces related to culture. Is the teacher engaging in ongoing reflection? Are we learning in different contexts? When we think about in-services, are we always having people come to us? Or are we going out to learn things from different people in our community? What are we reflecting on? What are we thinking about in terms of student groups and not necessarily classifying them at the same, because we recognize that there are variations in how students look at information and take it in. And then teachers being in a situation where they have to be aware of differences. Two more for us here. Thinking about cognitive pieces. So standardized testing, and I can have a whole other presentation on that alone. They're not necessarily these things, while people say they mean well, we recognize, and we saw this thing during COVID as well, assessment agendas for education are not interested in preparing creative thinkers, which can be very bad for Native youth because they do look at things in a little bit more creative fashion and as they take in things from a more sensory standpoint. When we think about classroom climate, do we create climates where students can express their body in multiple ways? How do we think about critical thinking? And then ethically, how does our physical education account for challenges that students face? And do we think about the classroom as a way of letting those students thrive, or do we frame a narrative? What types of postings are we putting up? What type of curriculum are we putting up? Here are a couple things as well. And as I mentioned here, sometimes it's the approach to the activity, not the activity. So these communication pieces we see here: hospitality, greeting, silent space, collaboration. We're thinking about practical interventions here, reducing isolation, generational splits, which is actually working with different intergenerational groups to work together. Thinking about historical context and not being afraid to talk about those with courage. And we have a few other things here, and then we'll wrap up for some questions with the general group. So placemaking is a very important thing. One of the things that I write about in this particular article is making sure that we foster appropriate language, because language is an intro into how a space is inviting for people. So these are some things here we'll see. Obviously, inclusive language, having youth use positive language, creating what is called a culture of somebodysness. Dr. King had talked about things such as equality and empathy, and recognizing that everyone has worth and dignity, but recognizing that people are multidimensional and everyone is a somebody, for lack of a better word. Giving students voice in the classroom, and so those are some examples there. How are students, again, constructing curriculum? Are you having students design and teach lessons? Are you creating groups where the role is important and where the power dynamics are not skewed? And then the last one here is learning about others. And there are some different pieces you can look at there when we talk about social justice frameworks and anti-racist frameworks, in making sure that we are doing things such as border crossing, which is the third point there, which is an opportunity to extend what goes on in the school to what goes on in students' lives, and how those things are very intersectional. So for spaces, briefly, we still see racism in sport and rec spaces. So think about it in terms of, even though we say that people are connected to the land, that we only see that people of color make up just 40% of the, they make up 40% of the United States population, but 70% of the people who visit land and national forests are white. We see things that should be named differently. This is from Sandy Creek Battleground. And the point to make here is the fact that we need to call things what they are. But the other point here on the side is that 2015, a little bit under 1,500 federally recognized places were still contained with slurs. Now, federally recognized places, that's not even including the stuff that are the informal places where people play. We see still in the news, Native American athletes and fans face ongoing racism. So these are things that we need to think about in a recreational standpoint, in terms of, I blocked out one of the bad things there in one of the bad words there in the middle, in terms of shock moments. And then last but not least, we talked about the pandemic and how even in cities, we look at structural racism and how they impact people of color in terms of greater harm to Black, Indigenous people. So that is all I had, because I did say we want to have some time. So these are some questions that I provided to the group. What areas are you currently needing more insight on? If there are points of advocacy that outside the community can make it to the rest of the public, what would they be? What is your feelings about Indigenous representations in 2023? And probably the most important thing, what are some things that we have questions about that we might need a little bit more insight on? So I'm going to stop sharing, and we'll have a few minutes to sort of talk as a group and kind of see where we are.
Dr. Culp, is it okay to just go ahead and ask a question?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you, Lee.
All right. Well, my name is Lee Anderson, and I'm a teacher in Minnesota, and I really appreciate this presentation. I'm learning a ton, and I'm very inspired and energized. So thank you very much. And I'm wondering, I know this is being recorded, and the slides, are you going to share these slides? Are we going to have access to the?
Without a doubt.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, Lee, because I did recognize this was a lot. And I actually had to pare down a few things, but as I mentioned before, we wanted to make sure we give some historical background for those things to make sense. So, yep.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Yes.
So I work at school. I'm not a teacher. I work with special ed students and stuff like that. But one of the things is the school that I work for is Fond du Lac. And we go all over the place to pick the kids up. And I've noticed between like the area that we live in, the local government is always trying to get kids into the public schools and pushing parents to do that. And there's a lot of propaganda being spread about the school that I work for and things like that. And so we don't even have half of the population of students attending our school. But the other thing is that during COVID, when kids were coming back to school, there was so many issues, and I know that all schools dealt with the issues. But one of the things that it really hit me hard was um, our school and is still following so much of that European style teaching methods. Our curriculum that we use is, through the state and things like that. And I'm just wondering, like, how there's a lot of culture that we try to bring in, but on the other hand, sit at your desks, don't move, stay silent, those types of things. How do you get people within the school, especially, like in my position where I'm just, a lower person, to get more involved in bringing back and just getting rid of that European teaching style altogether?
Yeah, that is a great question. And there's not one answer to it. That's the sad part about it. I think if I were in people's shoes and I'm thinking about how to advocate for better, more culturally responsive, inclusive education, what I'm going to go to first are the unbelievable public health statistics and the statistics about dropout and statistics about all these different rates that we showed in this presentation. I'm probably going to find some advocates to help me go to that first, because of the fact that, as I mentioned before, we recognize that when students' culture is not represented, then they're not going to do necessarily well in class. So that would be the first thing, is to try to find some people who can help advocate for that discussion. I think we also have to recognize as well, and some of this is that trying to find community partners who can help with that as well. So I don't know if there's elders, I don't know if there's parents, I don't know who could be people who could potentially be involved in that school in order to create some type of resource council or discussion, so that these issues can be talked about in mass, and then those things are presented, for instance, to a school board or some type of legislator who can assist with that particular process. And this is with the understanding that I know that is not a complete answer, because when we talk about European schools and European influence on schools, that's a very politically charged topic right now, which is why I mentioned before, part of this issue is trying to find people who are thinking on the same wavelength, so that these different types of discussions can be had from an advocacy standpoint. And hopefully something like this may help, but it's not going to be something, unfortunately, that will happen overnight. I don't know if anybody else has any comments on that or questions.
I'm sorry, I hit the wrong button.
I'm sorry, no worries. Yeah.
No, that's okay. So 20 years ago, when the school first opened, my eldest was one of the very first students to join. And at that time, they offered, like free lunches and free breakfast for families to come and join. They really wanted more of the community to come in, but over the past 20 years, I mean, we there was that shooting in Red Lake and, things like that. They put more restrictions on who can come into the school and, background checks. A lot of the families aren't going to pass the background check required to come into the school. So that's just one of the things that we run into. So the school has become more closed off over the last 20 years since it opened. The other thing too, that when we came back from COVID, I did bring that up to some, I'm like, bring the kids outside, let them just breathe some, fresh air and things. I mean, understandable, we live in Minnesota weather, so, we can't do it all year round, but just getting rid of the desks, because, that was one of the things. They had to have the kids come on opposite days for the first part, when they first were opening the school. But I'm like, why do we have why do we have to have the desks? It doesn't make sense, and at that time I wasn't working for the school, I was working for a different entity. But yeah, it's just yeah, so many changes. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. I mean, it's frustrating. And, part of the challenge too is, unfortunately, this is the emergent area of work because, as I mentioned earlier, there's been such few attention paid to this. So the hope is that as we continue to drive these things in these type of discussions, and the type of facilitation that's happening from what the YouTube videos and the resources I've seen, is that people can make more pointed demands, but also back them up with research and back them up with data. Because when you talk to me about 17% of Native American or people who identify as Indigenous are not going on to secondary education, well, you're telling me right now we're already dealing with a big issue. So yeah, unfortunately, the answer to your question has multi-layers, and not enough time for us to really talk about it. And really, maybe that's something we can think about for the future, is trying to find some people in that area who can help speak to that piece. Because I can guarantee you there are folks there in Minnesota where you're at who really feel passionate about that as well.
Well, thank you for your advice, and I really enjoyed the focus group tonight.
Thank you. I think we have time for a few more questions. We have a 4 minutes according to what I see. I want to be very respectful of people's time, but again, I can stay here as long as people need to. And other questions or comments or concerns, that's a part of it as well, or just general ideas.
I will ask another question then,
Sure.
Dr. Kulp. You brought up whiteness. And my question is, what do you think, the impact whiteness still has on the educational system?
Great question. I deal with this a lot when we talk about Black youth. Multicultural youth is, well, what we consider multicultural, because that's another word to unpack for another day. The central issue with whiteness is that whiteness is seen as the standard. It is the standard bearer for how we interpret anything in our society, and particularly how we look at youth, from body image to what they should be expected to know in terms of education, to legal pieces. And I'm glad you said whiteness, because a lot of times people think that, okay, well, whiteness is solely about just white people, but we recognize the fact that you don't have to be white in order to transmit this view of whiteness in education. So it's the curriculum. We need to make more informed and culturally responsive choices when we think about curriculum. When we do things such as imagery, very important as well, because as I mentioned in the presentation, we are fighting something that whiteness created. And that's the simple answer to that question, because as I mentioned before, it is really multi-layered. So I hope that got at it a little bit. So the answer to your question is that it's still too prevalent. Someone put a question in the chat, I think Amelia did, if I pronounce her name right. So what's a simple way to start implementing the last few topics into a classroom? I feel that it's easier to say that say this is what we need to do versus having specific changes of the changes needed to be made. Sorry, I would unmute, but it's loud where I'm at. And that is a great question. So I would probably say, for instance, if you look at the idea of somebodyness that I mentioned before with Dr. King, part of what I think we do not recognize enough is the power of imagery in a classroom. So oftentimes it is literally taking pictures of people that are not necessarily in headdresses or wearing Native American clothing or looking like savages, and presenting people who are Native American in normal scenarios. I don't think people recognize like how unbelievably powerful that is. I think another piece is recognizing history. So in terms of like how you set up a classroom so that when that student walks in that classroom, they visually see somebody who could look like them. In terms of like that's one piece in terms of like what can be done about that tomorrow. I think from a physical education standpoint, I think we have to think about, as I mentioned before, what are the types of choices that we're picking in curriculum? Are we always choosing these power versus performance games? Are we always doing these team sports, big time games? Are we putting people in situations where they can cooperate, and depending on developmental level, are they able to reflect upon that? And are they able to, for instance, do an assignment where they ask their parents or someone closest to them how they feel about a game or activity, or how they felt as you? Those are two of the things that I think are easiest that come to my mind in terms of how you can structure some pieces. But great question, Amelia. All right. So as I mentioned before, I'm fine to stay here a few more minutes. We are at time. I will do whatever people would like me to do, but I also recognize that people have some things that go on. This presentation will be sent to you. I know it's a lot. I'm going to also send to Susan and Dan my contact information. So if you have any other questions, let me know. And I can provide some resources, or at least maybe some things to think about, because as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, I am not an expert in this particular area. I'm learning a lot. And as I mentioned before, the fact that we don't have more professors who really think about this is really a deficit for us, but it's not something that we can't overcome, because we do have Indigenous professors in North America and the United States. We just have to create a better network on how to have these discussions. So I'm going to stop recording.